So welcome to day 2 of the Wildlife Trust at Groundswell, the Regenerative Farming Festival and Conference. Craig's passed on to me for day 2, so my name's Barnaby and I'm the Land Use Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trust. And we're delighted to be kicking off our second day at Groundswell with a panel discussion with the Nature Friendly Farming Network and Nethergill Associates, launching our new report, Farming at the Sweet Spot, where we find that actually, using data from over 160 different farms, that farming with nature is not only better for the environment, but can also make you more money. Join us for a panel where we discuss this with farmers who are on that journey and making more money.
Well, welcome everyone. Today's panel session, is all about a new report that's been produced by the Nature Friendly Farming Network and the Wildlife Trusts. And it's all about something called the sweet spot. And you're going to learn a lot more about it today, but it's a really interesting, maybe counterintuitive thing, but it's a fantastic thing to listen to. I'm Anthony Kerwin. I'm the England chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, and I also run a country estate in East Kent, trying to do some of these, if not all of these principles, but it's a long way to go, but it's a really interesting concept. Now, this report is based on farm accounts of over 160 farm businesses. This is not just an aspirational thing to put together. This is an actual detailed report put together, giving facts and figures about the importance of the sweet spot. Now today we're joined by 4 excellent panelists who will discuss this, what it could mean for farming, and from a national to a farm level scale. I'm joined by Barnaby Coop, Head of Food and Farming at the Wildlife Trusts, Chris Clark, Nethergill Associates, who undertook the farm business analysis with all the farms. He's also is a farmer, has been a farmer, and intrinsically his DNA is part of farming. So it's not just another academic report, it's someone coming who knows about farming. There's Nick Renison, who is, I'm not allowed to call her a nature-friendly farmer because she believes it's farming, and she does nature-friendly farming, and we should all be doing it. So she likes to be called a farmer. And James Robinson there, won the Silver Lapwing Award just a year ago, and also a dairy farmer in Cumbria. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Chris, who will outline who is the brains behind the whole sweet spot thing, and I'd like him to outline his thoughts on the sweet spot and the report.
Morning, everybody. Anthony, thank you very much. We all know that we're in a series of several crises, and 2 of them are the unprofitability of farming and the continuing downward trend of biodiversity and habitats. Now, the Sweet Spot report tackles, to some extent, those 2 issues. And there are 3 things that come out of that Sweet Spot report. Firstly, if you are at your sweet spot within a farm business, you are more profitable, you maximize your profitability, you optimize for nature, and you minimize your use of energy. And those are the 3 things that really come out of that report. But let me give you an overview. What is the sweet spot? And I will interchange between MSO, maximum sustainable output, and sweet spot. So they all mean the same thing. But MSO, maximum sustainable output, the sweet spot, it is a theory of realizing that in farming, possibly uniquely, the standard economic model of the firm, which relies entirely on linear variable cost driving production, is invalid. The model that we've been following since post-Second World War does not work. So, because in farming, the variable costs decompose. There's not one variable cost, but two sequential components that, as a result, that they drive increasing profitability when you understand that there are 2 different variable costs. When you don't understand that, driving production drives you to unprofitability. So that's the overview. How does it work in practice? Well, these 2 elements in variable costs are PVCs, productive variable costs. They are associated with working with nature. They take the solar energy and allow farmers to work with that to drive their profitability. As an adjunct to that, on every farm, on every square meter on every farm, when the sun is shining, there is 1.36 kilowatt hours of solar energy available. It's called the solar constant. So we got the PVCs working with nature. You've got the corrective variable cost, CVCs, where farming activities that relate to substituting for nature, using industrial energy to substitute for the corrections that you need for elevation or precipitation or geology. So when you work with nature, instead of substituting for nature, you get to what's called an inflection point. And when you eliminate industrial energy, it may result in a reduction in output, but it results also in a significant increase in profitability. And we're getting to points now where farmers that are at that sweet spot are at the same levels of profitability that they were when, the same levels of output than they were when they were using heavy industrial use fertilizer. If we go to MSO, there has been a concern that we would become a danger to national food supplies as outputs reduce. However, moving to MSO it will help profitability, and profitability, not output volumes, are the real key to the security of our food supply. And intrinsically, unprofitable farming sector is undermining security supply by overproducing at ruinous costs. Given that output volumes can be expected to return to former levels, it is the transition to where we are now to where we need to be that needs attention, not the fear of the outcome. Surely, supporting the transition is a worthy objective for our centralized support payment system, notwithstanding that it could eventually lead to removing the need for support. So how does MSO farming differ from ordinary farming? At true MSO, the managed landscape that comprises a farm will have little or no farming inputs, except perhaps the occasional need for liming. Nature on such a farm can be said to be uncompromised and will create a credible pattern of biodiversity. The pattern will be unpredictable, and it will be important to avoid disappointment not to intervene. If you intervene, it only consumes more industrial energy. As all industrial energy will have been eliminated at the sweet spot, and all free issue energy will have been used up for maximum economic benefit, a farm at MSO will have a neutral energy balance. So to finish off, what happens is, when you move to the sweet spot, the farm will be at its most profitable, nature will be optimized, and the energy balance will be minimized. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that. I hope you're all making notes on the new acronyms. Really important, but I always think that ABA is another blooming acronym, but there you go. But they're really important to the concept of the sweet spot and the maximum sustainable output. So thanks, Chris, for that. And it's a lot to unpick there, and I hope it's going to generate some really interesting discussion going on. I'd now like to introduce Barnaby. Now, Barnaby, I've got the questions I want you to like to also ask is, why this work? Why this report from the Wildlife Trust perspective? Why now? And why have the Wildlife Trust been involved? So, Barnaby.
No, thank you, Anthony. I think Chris touched on it when he used the word crisis, when he introduced it. I think we are undoubtedly facing a nature and climate crisis in this country. 1 in 9 species in the UK are currently faced with extinction. We've seen continuing trends in the graphs for all species, pollinators, farmland birds heading downwards. And I think with farming, there's huge opportunity, a really huge opportunity here to start to actually take action to reverse those declines. We know that 70% of the UK is farmed. And if that 70% is, takes action like we're seeing here today at Groundswell, that could be a fantastic opportunity. But unfortunately, it's no real secret that over recent decades, the steady intensification of our farming businesses in the UK has had a huge impact on nature. We're in the currently where we're at, 10% of greenhouse gases in the UK come from our farming. It's the main polluter of our waterways. It's the single biggest reason why many of our SSIs are failing their standards. So really, we really need to see a big change in our farming systems if we are to start to realise that thriving nature that we want to see. I think with this report, we've been really keen to stress that we don't put this blame on the farmers at all. It's not the fault of farmers. it is a broken system. It's a broken farming system and a broken food system which we face in this country. The current metric success of our farms is based around productive output, which externalizes the cost to nature. It's a system which is reliant on huge amounts of artificial fertilizers and pesticides, and it's a system which is really quite profligate in how it uses resources. We know that a lot of the land we use to grow crops is actually fed to animals, biodigesters, or into our cars, when it could actually be used to feed humans. So really, our new report offers a roadmap to an alternative future for what the 70% of our farmland in the UK could look like. But we know that if we're actually to make sure this future becomes a reality, we need to work with farmers. And that's why at the Wildlife Trusts, we've been super excited to launch this report in partnership with the Nature Friendly Farming Network and with Nethergill Associates. Because really, the current system isn't working for farmers either. We know it's not working for nature, but currently our farmers are facing an absolute multitude of pressures, whether that's from the nature and climate crisis itself, with declining soil health, populations of beneficial insects, water quality and water availability set to become a really important thing over the coming months, but also increasing volatility in international supply chains, particularly around inputs. So what we've seen happening with the Ukraine crisis and fertilizer and fuel costs, and also an uncertain future with policy schemes across all four nations of the UK, actually, as we transition from a post-Brexit system. So there is really a clear opportunity here to come up with a better system which delivers for farmers and for nature, and start to deliver some of those critical targets, halting species loss by 2030 and achieving 30% of our land for nature by 2030 as well. These are really big, ambitious targets, and they're coming up fast. So this report really comes at a critical time to start to see what farmers can do in terms of helping to drive that forward, as well as supporting their farm businesses.
Thanks, Barnaby. Thanks very much. It's good to get the overview of the Wildlife Trust's perspective on all of this. And from someone who's been involved in the farming industry all my life and know farmers very well, and I won't comment on all of the ones I know, but it's interesting to know that you're not blaming farmers per se, you're blaming society and the farming system for wanting the third cheapest food in the world. And that's what's created this. Because to make a change, we've all got to do this together. We've got to take everyone with us. And I think that's really good, not to have the blame culture. Now, bring some real farmers into it. Nick, off you go.
Tired, hungover farmers.
Well, speak for you. Well, no, join me as well. Okay.
What do you want me to say?
Well, what I want to say is, how does a sweet spot, how does it affect your farming business? How are you applying it? What are you doing on your farm? Expand on how you're making a difference on your farm, aiming for the sweet spot and the nature-friendly practices you are actually undertaking.
Okay, so a bit of background. We moved to our farm in 2012 with a huge mortgage, and I come back from a dairy farmer background. Renault had previously managing a fell farm and in a conventional mindset. So we got to the farm thinking we want to farm and we want to be productive and efficient and all those kind of words that you hear people say about how we need to kind of save the world. And we quickly realised that our life was going to be quite hard, quite miserable, and we were just going to be hamsters on a wheel, going around, paying bills, lambing sheep, going around. And part of our finances was we had to work on in different organisations, and one of these was a sheep genetic company, and we met loads of sheep farmers and good grassland sheep farmers. And one of those in Northumberland, the Nellis brothers, they were doing a really good job with grass, and that kind of got us thinking more holistically, more about making the sun and the grass and just making the most of what we've got. And so we came to the sweet spot really through purely financial reasons. So we kind of looked at every cost, and I remember saying to Renault, my husband, I don't want you to buy anything until we've really thought about it, even if it's just a brush. So you have to kind of pin down everything. So now we've created a system where we don't use fertilizer. We haven't used fertilizer since 2015. All the ruminants are grass-fed. We stack enterprises, so we have chickens and pigs following the cows in rotation. And we also have glampers. And and it's just making the most of what we've got without buying any metal, really. And since we've done that and we've reduced stock numbers slightly, the system is kind of singing a little bit more than it was. So our vet bills are significantly less. Sometimes they're nothing. When the monthly bills come in, sometimes the vet bill is nothing, and that is tremendous. So it's just we've come to this situation by default, really, and also the environment, the kind of wildlife on the farm is just really just getting better and better from a very low base year on year.
I think that's really interesting, Nick. And what I find fascinating from what you were saying then is you aimed for the nature friendly, you aimed for the sweet spot through business. It was a business decision. Obviously, you want to do it, but it was a business decision.
Because previously, people like the Wildlife Trust used to really irritate me.
Well, I'm glad we're not anymore.
But so I was brought up obviously on a dairy farm, and the mere size of a badger. So it's very much through kind of thinking differently, environmentalist. Oh. So yeah.
I love this, I really do. And now over to James, a dairy farmer, an organic dairy farmer in Cumbria. And if he wants anything about hedges, he's also the man to talk to. So over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Yeah, I am self-confessed hedge nerd from Cumbria. So we are organic dairy farm. The farm's been in the family for a long time. So the farm has been in the family since 1875. I'm the 5th generation, and then there's my son Robert, who's the 6th generation, who's hopefully at home and hopefully got up better than I did this morning, anyways. So about 20 years ago, we had the milk price was horrendous. Conventional milk price was horrendous. We were seeing massive peaks and troughs, all to do with world trade, and dairy is such a traded commodity that the flux is just crazy. It's peaks and troughs all the time. Very hard to make long-term business decisions, and you feel like you're fighting fires and chasing your tail all the time. So we looked at organic then because the price was the price margin then was considerable. So it was a business decision, but it was also an ethical decision because we've always been very wildlife friendly on the farm in terms of habitats and stuff. But we did still used to use a fair bit of fertiliser. So we're using 45 tonne of artificial fertiliser a year on our 300 acres. So all that input was costing money, and the fertiliser price was another thing that used to go up and down as well. So we just felt that we weren't in control of our supply, and we certainly weren't in control of our market either. So being organic has given us much more control. So it's a much smaller market, much more domestic, so much less exposed to the world trade. In terms of farming, we didn't really have to make a huge amount of change apart from the fertiliser input, and yes, a few sprays, but the fertiliser input caused a massive cliff edge of grass growth, because if you were going to go down this route, you would ordinarily do it perhaps over 5 years. So cliff edge approach, day one, no fertiliser. Massive yield loss, probably down to about 60% over the first 2, perhaps 3 years. And then the ground catches up. The ground sort of realises that, hang on a minute, I'm not going to get that fertiliser put on now. I have to start growing. You've already introduced legumes, clover and stuff, so you're creating your own fertiliser. You're looking at soil health and stuff. You're looking at the stuff that actually is already on your farm rather than looking at putting inputs on to grow the stuff. We've done soil tests, so we've looked at, originally when we converted, obviously usual PK and pH stuff. And the indexes are exactly the same now as what they were 19 years ago, despite the fact that we're not putting that 40 tonne of bought-in inputs a year. And the production is virtually the same. We're about 95% in terms of off-farm production than what we were at the time, and that's with a much lower input. So we feel that we're much more sustainable. We've also cut things like soya and palm oil out of the bought-in feed because we really see that as a... we are just offshore in our wildlife and our environmental impact, really. Yes, we have to buy in feed, but the protein now is mainly sourced from UK, if not Europe. So we've got, we're just looking at the ghost acres, as it were, and the ghost inputs that come onto the farm, because we shouldn't just, close our eyes to everything that's happening away. Things like wormers and dung beetles and that sort of stuff, fly treatment, we're also really, really topical with that. We don't use fly treatment on probably 95% of the animals. Wormers, the same. There's hardly any actually get. It's just individual wormers, and then that improves things like dung beetles and stuff as well. So, as a side effect from being more economic with wormers and fly treatment, you're then improving animal health overall and the dung beetle population, for instance, which then helps bats and stuff. So, there's a lot of really good side effects from being much more conscious of the inputs that are coming onto the farm.
Well, thanks, James. One of the things I'm hearing constantly going through Groundswell is hamster on a wheel, and hamsters aren't subsidised. And one of the things that also frightens many, many farmers, I think, and I want your take on this, the report goes on, you stop outputs, you mentioned the cliff edge. To get off that wheel is a scary thing to do. How have your businesses coped with that initial change? Chris, please feel free to jump in on the cash and everything else from the business consultancy. But how have you dealt with that massive change, not just psychologically but financially?
Well, I might as well come in as soon as I've got the microphone. Being organic at the time, and I think there is still, but there was some really good conversion grants. So you get 2 years of, there were reasonable conversion grants, and that is there for your loss in production pretty much. It nowhere covers it, so you've got to be prepared. We sold a few, we sold some excess stock and things just to cover it. But then things quickly pick up again. It isn't. You mustn't think of the yield reduction being long term. It is very much short term. 2 to 3 years after that initial 2 years in terms of organic, and then you are pretty much back up where you should be. And the farm really, all of a sudden, you sort of mentioned, didn't you? It all of a sudden just seems to come together. And it does, and it just, things just come to life somehow, and it is just, the farm just sorts itself out. But yeah, you need understanding bank managers, and they need to be with you on it as well. They need to understand why you're doing and what you're doing, and if they understand it, then they really should be really supportive, because it is absolutely the way forward.
Yeah, so when Renault had his light bulb moment, we just stopped using fertiliser, and we're not organic. We're not kind of we farm organically, but we're not organic. So we didn't have the conversion payments. But so you have 3 years, and it's like I often say, it's like coming. It must be like coming off heroin, because you have that huge dip. So I think policy-wise, there could be some help to get through those 3. I think it was 3 years for us before everything starts. But also it's a kind of mindset thing that you've got to. You can't really do this for the money. You've got to believe in it, and then you stick with the course. So if you don't believe in it, you'll kind of get to year 2 and think, oh, sod this, I'm going to go back to my old ways. So it's hearts and minds and having a belief. But also I think we probably need some help.
Yeah, and I think on that help, I think that's where I mentioned earlier with moving away from previous common agricultural policies from when we were in Europe. We're now in a position where we're setting in the UK our own agri-environment schemes, and I think they can play a really crucial part in de-risking that pathway and supporting farmers to go on that transition, not just from a financial perspective, but also from an advice perspective. I think that's going to be critical, and then support for peer-to-peer learning, farm clusters, so actually farmers don't feel like they're going on that journey on their own and shouldering all that risk themselves. So one thing that Wildlife Trust are working hard to do is to ensure that those new schemes really support this kind of farming.
Thanks, Barnaby. And I'm over to Chris now. Now, when I started speaking to Chris about the MSO, the sweet spot, a few years ago, he'd done 28 farmers. Now it's 160 businesses there. So you can see he's been a very busy chap. But particularly, how do farmers, from your perspective, from the consultancy role, deal with that initial shock?
Thanks, Anthony. We're not only on 160, we're up to 220 now.
Apologies.
With another 50 on the stocks to do. Everything that Nick and James have talked about is absolutely right, but there is this philosophical acceptance of change, that it is not about driving production as your measure of success. Farmers can look over each other's hedges, walls, fences, and make a judgment. But what they can't do is judge your P&L account on your balance sheet. And so you have to have a lot of confidence to go through down this route. We're finding that after 4 or 5 years of gradual change, the natural soil fertility is building back up, and that yields are building year on year from there on in. And we're exactly the same as these two. The farms that we're working with are at about 95% of their output without all the inputs. We did some work in North Wales. We looked at 37 different farms. 5 of those farms had never used fertilizer. And yet those farms were the most profitable and had as good, if not better, dry matter yields per hectare than the farms using intensive fertilizer. This was a surprise to us. It was a surprise to them. It was a surprise to the people who commissioned the research. But there is now going to be a huge change in that particular area because of the research and the findings that we have established. Just going on for one more thing, Anthony, we're also finding that when we do research on groups of farms, it encourages those farms to work together and collaborate more. And it is going to be this collaboration between farms, this self-help, if you like, sharing of machinery, sharing of knowledge that's going to take farmers from where they are now to where they need to be.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, it was mentioned just now about a sympathetic bank manager. I always thought it's one of my favourite oxymorons, but obviously they exist. And but some real interesting live facts, research has gone into this report. You've heard what farmers have done and the difference it has made. And it is a mindset. I remember when I first no-till drilled, and it's meant to be lovely brown earth with green rows and all looking, smiling at you. When I first direct drilled, I thought, ye gods, what have I done? But actually, it becomes a mindset, and it now looks awful if I haven't done something like that. So it's getting the change of mindset that's so important. And there's classic examples here. But the question I've got to ask the whole panel, what the heck's holding us back? What is holding the industry back? What is holding us all back?
Part of the problem is this belief that output is the only measure. And actually the only measure is profitability. And we very rarely find farms that do proper business budgets. And we now complete cash flows, we do P&Ls and balance sheets, we look at return on total assets, and yet these are numbers that the farming industry doesn't look at. And that's partly due to the approach of accountants. We go into farms and look at their accounts, and in the revenue line will say £200,000, but that revenue includes livestock or cereal payments, but it also includes support, it'll include self-catering figures. Accountants have a lot of blame to be attached to how they handle their farming clients.
And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. You need to know your costs if you're going to do anything. And a lot of people probably don't even open the accounts. They probably get posted through, and then, yeah, by the time the next year comes, they might have opened them. I think the thing that's holding farming back is farming. I think we are just awful at, I mean, not today, not here, but in general, it's farmers that are just so adverse to change and adverse to moving forward, and and farmers are also constantly thinking, I wonder what people will think if I do this. And we shouldn't. We should just worry about our own farms. We've given up thinking what people think of our nettles and our big sprawling hedges, and our short-horn cows that everyone got rid of years ago. They are doing a fantastic job for us. And just do what's right for your farm. Don't try and follow a trend. Don't try and be something you're not. Just do what's right, and it will. Yeah, you will see, and then people will eventually follow.
I think the question as well is possibly how do we ramp it up, not what's holding it back. I think, in the space of us commissioning this report from Nethergill, and now you've got almost a third extra farms. If you have a look at events like where we are now at Groundswell, it's 6,000 people here over these 2 days. It's a huge amount of people, and it's a huge growth of where we're going in that direction. So I think it's about how can we turbocharge that and give farmers the confidence that actually this is a journey worth going on. And the confidence that if they do go on that journey, they're going to be supported. And I think, with that mindset, that growth mindset, we can really start to drive forward ambitious change.
I think subsidies have hindered innovation hugely. I know it's changing now, and I guess this is partly why Groundswell is getting bigger and bigger every year. I think the agricultural education system is woeful, supported by big business, and they're still teaching them all the old stuff. And I think farmers have got to realise that they've got to be driving the bus. They don't need a land agent or someone else steering them in the direction. They need to be in the driving seat and not relying on all the trade stands here to be telling them what to do. They need to go out there and get their heads in books, get their heads in YouTubes, talk to other farmers, and really widen their horizon, I suppose, which is slightly patronising. But I think we need to stop relying on other people to educate us. We need to go out there and do it.
I think that's absolutely right. And it was meant to be also a lead-in to the nature-friendly farming network, because what as a network we're doing, and these two farmers on my left are especially doing, is networking and doing extension work on a vast scale to try and get people to try and come along on this journey. Overused word journey, but you know what I mean. But I think it's also up to all of us. We're moaning, quite rightly, at the agricultural colleges, which are hugely production focused. But Groundswell here, we're all talking to the converted. We need to go out of our comfort zone. All of us need to be outside our comfort zone. We should be in cereals. We should be at the Oxford Farming Conference showing this evidence. I think, I don't know what you think of that, but we've also, all of us have got to, and the education for children and everything else is essential. And all of us who, if we want change, we haven't got to just do it on our own farms. We've actually got to go and broadcast that information, even if it's outside our comfort zone. That's my belief. And I'm going to put another items for discussion coming on here. And one is, how often have we heard about national farm food security? Anyone want to kick off? Because I could kick off forever on this one, but anyone else want to kick off on that? Chris.
In my view, it is impossible to have a proper food security policy unless the industry producing that food is profitable. The business model that has been proposed and educated for and used over the last 80 years has failed us. And unless farmers are profitable, before support, and for me, profitable means output, pre-support output, minus variable costs, minus your fixed costs. So it's contribution level 2. Unless the industry is profitable before support at that level, we cannot have food security in this country.
Yeah, and I think the word food security crisis does get thrown around, but I think what seems bizarre to me is that the way that is often seen to get out of that food security crisis is to do more of what we have been doing over the last 50 years. More of the same types of farm business, more intensification. And actually, I'm just going to read out this quote, which we have in our report here, which is from the UK Food Security Report in 2021, which says that sustainable production methods ensure the UK's long-term food security by protecting natural capital. So food security rests ultimately not on maximising domestic production, but on making the best use of land types. And I think that comes into it. We need sustainability. Sustainability is the most important thing when it comes to food security. And I think that's environmental sustainability, making sure we're operating without externalising those environmental costs, but also economic sustainability, as Chris just said. And ultimately, in terms of where we're going with the nature and climate crisis, we are going to need to adapt our farm businesses, our farm practices, and actually embrace resilience as part of a productive and profitable farm system. Just look at the last couple of summers, the droughts. I think we're technically in a drought at the moment, I think, and even things like wildfires are going to become a much bigger issue. So actually, how we look forward at how can we adopt practices which help to increase that resilience is going to be critical to ensuring that food security in the future.
Yeah, the kind of we need to feed the world thing. I just don't. I think we need to feed ourselves, and my, like you all say, the system at the minute. Some organisations defend it to the hilt, but is that system working? look at our rivers. It's a broken system, and we've got to kind of wake up and smell the coffee, and be quite pushy on that, and not kind of toe the feed the world line.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, there's nothing working at the moment. Farmers aren't making any money. We've got people that can't afford to buy food, but we've got an obesity crisis, we've got health crisis, social care crisis. Everything comes back to really how we treat the land and what we eat. And it is broken at the moment, and we just need to do something different.
Well, I'm going to start wrapping it up now, and I would like everybody. The opportunity is not to ask questions from the floor, but to mingle. Come and talk to us. Come and talk to everyone. That's the point of this. And I'll leave on two things. I'm going to challenge the authors of this report to come up with model number 2 with even more detailed figures and anonymized. Because if we can show case studies showing the margins, showing what the regenerative towards the MSO and sweet spot achieves, then we'll take the doubters with us, because it'll be economic fact and you have to do it. So I put that challenge down to you, and Chris is going to want to come in. Go on, Chris, off you go.
You're absolutely right, Anthony, and we've started doing that. Let me give you two numbers. Unless a farm has fixed costs that are at 40% of their pre-support revenue, they will not make money. Number one. Number two, unless their vet and med bills are round about the 4 to 5 or 6% of their pre-support revenue, they're not going to make money. That's what we're finding with the 200 plus farms that we have reviewed. So we will continue to bring these numbers out.
And it's going to be interesting if we do this again next year. It'll probably be 300 or 400 farms the way you're going, Chris. I'd like to thank everyone for coming.
Sorry, just on that, Anthony, as well. I think one thing that this report really does, building on from a previous report we did with Nethergill Associates, was actually show that this model is applicable across a much broader range of farm types than just marginal hill farms. And I think what I'd really like to see next, I know I've spoken to Chris about this, is actually looking at different farm systems, especially looking at horticulture, which we know at the moment is a gap in the evidence. Not to say that this doesn't apply, it just hasn't been looked at yet. And I think that's a gap which we're really keen to look at with you.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks everyone very much indeed. And thanks for your attendance.